Hello folks, this is Professor Watts. In this video I'm going to walk us through some of the cost function concepts that we're interested in microeconomics from the standpoint of a firm and profit maximizing decision making. So we'll take a look at the definitions and then we'll jump over into Excel and we'll work through a kind of pretty standard textbook type problem where we're given a table of inputs and outputs and some basic cost data. We'll work through and want to calculate each one of the cost functions that we're interested in. Okay, let's start off by putting costs in the context of the income statement accounting. And here I have the basic income statement equation. Total revenue minus total cost equals profit or loss. And of course this is paramount for a profit-oriented business. You need to calculate profit, and to work towards maximizing profit you need to know the revenue and the costs. Now we're going to focus on the cost side in today's lesson. The total revenue, just briefly, is of course product price times quantity, or TR equals PQ. That's actually relatively straightforward in our competitive market model where the price is just given, what we call price taker market. So in competitive models that aspect is actually pretty straightforward, and then it's the cost side that gets a little more complicated because there's several different ways to break down costs, and that's what we're going to focus on. So we start off with the idea of total cost equals fixed plus variable cost, or TC equals FC plus VC, and we want to talk about this distinction between fixed and variable costs and then talk about different ways to break down the costs. So first off, let's define fixed cost. Costs incurred regardless of output level, right? Even if there's no production, you're going to have to pay some fixed costs. Okay, you rent a building, you have a 12-month lease, let's say you can't get out of it, that cost is going to be incurred whether you're working there or not. Taxes, fixed cost. Okay, there's a lot of other examples. Costs that a firm has to face regardless of how much output they produce. Okay. Now we have the fixed cost and we can average it out. Average fixed cost is simply fixed cost divided by the quantity produced. Fixed cost per unit of output. So there's our formula for average fixed cost. And then we have variable cost, costs associated with producing output, and of course they vary with the level of output. If you produce more output, you're going to have higher variable costs, whereas your fixed cost doesn't change. Okay, so the classic example here would be labor. Factory wants to produce more output, they have to hire more workers, or a construction company wants to do more building, they're going to have to hire more workers and buy more lumber. So in that case, lumber and workers would be a variable cost. But something like machinery they've already bought, that's a fixed cost. They're going to have that sitting around incurring costs whether they use it or not. Okay, then we take the average variable costs, simply variable cost divided by quantity, and that gives us the variable cost per unit of output. Okay, then the total cost, and remember total cost is simply fixed cost plus variable cost, and then the average total cost is simply total cost divided by quantity, and that's going to be designated AC or ATC. Those mean the same thing. You might see both depending on the textbook that you use. Okay, and finally, the only other cost category that we're interested in before we jump into an example and work through how to actually calculate these things is marginal cost. And marginal in economics, you want to think of that meaning extra. We're talking about the extra cost incurred when we produce an extra unit of output, one extra unit. And the way we find that is the change in total cost with the extra unit of output, with the change in quantity. And technically this is a calculus concept where you take the derivative of the total cost curve. And in your advanced classes you might be doing that, but in a simple class we'll just estimate this by calculating the change in total cost from one production level to another and then dividing that by the change in quantity from one production level to another, and we'll get a pretty close approximation of marginal cost that'll typically be good enough for some basic accounting purposes. Okay, so that brings us to an example, and the focus of this video is really just to show you how to calculate all the different kinds of costs: average fixed cost, average variable cost, total cost, marginal cost. I've set up a problem that's based on a textbook problem that we might be looking at, and we've got a very simple example of the small house painting business, and there's really only two kinds of costs. This is to keep things simple so we can get a handle on it and do the calculations easily. Okay, so we've got Mike hires students at $250 a week to paint houses. What kind of cost is that going to be? That's going to be a variable cost, because if he doesn't paint any houses, he's not hiring any workers and not incurring it. Okay, and then it says in B, regardless of the number of students he hires, Mike leases 3 airless sprayers, payments for which work out to $60 per week for all 3. Okay, regardless of the number of students he hires, that means regardless of how much painting they're actually doing. Okay, he's got to pay this the rent on these sprayers, that's the equipment you use to paint, regardless of whether they're working or not. So that's the fixed cost. Okay, so we've got a very simple example that involves some variable costs and some fixed costs. So then the total cost, of course, is going to be the sum of this and this, but this one varies with the level of output. So what we're going to have to look at is we'll make kind of a table of how many workers we use, how much product they produce. That's what we've got right here. And we'll put all this into a spreadsheet, and we'll actually have the spreadsheet calculate for us. Okay, what are the fixed costs going to be? What are the variable costs going to be? What are the total costs going to be? Add it all up, find the averages of fixed and variable and total costs, and then actually find the marginal costs as well. And that's what we want to do in the second problem here. We want to construct the average fixed cost, variable cost, total cost, and marginal cost. And then we'll look at the difference between total cost and variable cost, and we'll see that that's the same. That amounts to this difference here between total cost and variable cost. That amounts to the fixed costs. What we're going to do is just take this data here and import it into a spreadsheet. And I've actually set that up right here in Excel. So you'll notice I've got the workers and output, number of houses they paint per week, transported in here into Excel. And I've set up, and if you want to set this up in your own spreadsheet, just pause the screen right here and create all these categories. Up here I've written the variable cost and fixed cost, and the reason why I've written them is just makes it easy to use cell references to work those into the calculations we'll do down here. Okay, now we're going to focus on the cost. So I'm going to highlight actually the different cost categories here, everything over here that we'll be doing. We're going to be finding all these costs. Well, one thing I've included in here that's going to help us calculate one of these costs is the marginal product. Remember, marginal means extra. So when we're talking about marginal product, we're talking about the extra product we get from adding extra inputs. And here the only variable input is workers. So when we go from 0 to 1 workers, the output goes from 0 to 2. That means the marginal product here is 2. Okay. And when I go from 1 to 2 workers, output goes from 2 to 5. That means marginal product is 3. Now I could sit here and do this math in my head, but the value of a spreadsheet is that it does the math for us. So let me actually do this with a formula. And the formula is going to simply be equals the output level at that number of inputs, that number of workers, minus the previous output level. Okay. And if I don't lock these cell references, as I drag this formula down, it'll slide those cell references down. So note here that for marginal product for 6 workers, the formula is saying C12 minus C11. That's this minus this. That's exactly what I want it to do. So I'm going to use cell reference formulas and drag those formulas to populate this table pretty easily. Okay, now fixed costs. Remember, fixed costs, the definition is that they don't change with the level of output. That's the $60 Mike has to pay for his paint spray guns, regardless of how much work they're doing. So all we're going to do there is say equals 60 equals that cell. Now, when I slide this formula down, I want it to be the same every time, so I'm going to lock the reference. When you put the dollar signs, that tells Excel when I slide this down to not slide my reference box, but to keep it there. So I can put that in and just drag that down. An alternate way of doing that is just hit equals 60, and then if you do that and slide it down, you get the same result. Okay, so we've got the fixed cost. Now, average fixed cost. Remember, the formula for that was fixed cost divided by quantity. Now see, at 0 workers we have 0 quantity, so we're really not going to populate anything up in this top row, but we'll start here with 1 worker. We get 2 houses. So the average fixed cost is simply going to be the fixed cost at that level, E7, divided by the total quantity at that level. And I'm going to slide that formula down. I want the references to slide down with me. So for instance, 6 workers producing 15 output, my average fixed cost here is equal to E12, which is my fixed cost at that level, which is of course always the same, divided by C12, which is my output at that level. Okay. So you can see average fixed cost is declining, and that makes perfect sense when you think about it, because the fixed cost is the same, and we're averaging that out over larger and larger outputs as output goes up. Now when we think about graphing that, we want to graph cost as a function of quantity. Average fixed cost is going to get lower and lower and lower because we're dividing the fixed cost by a larger and larger level of output. So average fixed cost is going to look something like this. And we'll graph this, or we'll think about how the graphs work, because one nice thing about Excel and spreadsheets is that we can have it graph these cost curves for us as well once we've calculated them, or once we've calculated several points along them. Okay, so we've got fixed cost and average fixed. Let's move on to variable. How do costs vary with output? Well, this is the cost associated with hiring extra workers to do the work, and so it's basically going to be the variable cost per unit up here, which is 250, times the number of units of the input we hire, the number of workers we hire. So I'm going to take cell reference. I'm going to do the variable cost per unit times the number of units. And to make it able to slide down, I'm going to just lock the cell reference. Alternatively, we could just hit equals 250 times that cell, either way, and then fill this down. And you should see this marches up $250 at a time, as we would expect, because we're adding one worker at a time here in this table. So there's variable cost. Now, average variable cost, again, is very simple. We're going to take the variable cost at that level of output and divide it by the quantity at that level of output. So you can see G7 divided by C7 here. And again, fill this all the way down. So what happens to variable cost? Well, notice it gets smaller here for a while, bottoms out, and then starts going back up again. So let's go back to the graph. Variable cost does the average variable cost. And it could start above or below average fixed cost. It just depends on the comparative magnitude. In our case, it's higher, so it starts up here like this. It goes down for a while. It bottoms out, then it starts going back up. Average variable cost. Okay, now total cost. That, of course, equals fixed cost plus variable cost. At an output level of 0, we do have fixed cost. We don't have variable cost. The cell reference will work. And we'll want to slide that all the way down. Okay, and then that's going to just rise pretty much steadily with output. We're not interested in graphing the totals so much as the averages, so we won't graph that, but we need to calculate that so we can calculate the average total cost. So the average total cost is simply our total cost at that level of output divided again by the level of output. So this should be becoming very familiar to us by now, I hope. Let's fill that down. And now again, we'll notice that average total cost starts high, goes down, bottoms out, and then starts going back up again. Now what's driving that? And let's go back here and graph that. So average variable cost. And average total cost is now fixed and variable cost. So it's going to start high, go down, it's going to bottom out, and then start going back up. Now, it's actually not going to go up as steeply as average variable cost does, because the fixed cost component of this isn't growing like the variable cost component of this one is. So this has that fixed cost component in there that's actually diminishing. And so what happens is that the average total cost and average variable cost curves will approach each other, never quite touch. Now, as a business, let's just talk briefly while we've got this stuff here. Where are we interested in operating? We're talking about minimizing costs so we can maximize profits. And you'll notice that the minimums of these costs occur at some level of output. So we're typically not going to be interested in what's going on way out here where these have already curved upward. We're typically going to be interested kind of in this area right in here where we're minimizing costs. Okay, and that brings us to marginal cost. Now, marginal cost, to technically calculate marginal cost, we would be talking about the change in cost with a 1 unit change in output. And you'll notice here I'm not dealing with 1 unit change in outputs. I'm dealing with 2, 3, 4. Here I'm dealing with a 1, but I'm dealing with more than 1 unit changes in output. So I can't actually technically calculate the pure marginal cost function. What that would look like is this. Marginal cost would be the derivative of total cost with respect to quantity. And if I knew my total cost function, I could take the first derivative with some basic calculus. But here I don't. I don't know the function. I could actually try to work out an estimate of that function and then take the derivative. But that's pretty complex, and that's more than we need for this level of analysis. So what we're going to do for marginal cost is just approximate the change in cost over a range of output. So to calculate marginal cost from this data, we're basically just going to do an approximation, and that's going to work out to this. Marginal cost is approximately equal to our observed change in total cost over our observed change in quantity. So how do we calculate that? That's going to be just a function of the change in total cost. So I'm back here in my total cost column. From this level of output minus the previous level is total cost, divided by the change in quantity, which of course we could just go back here to output and say this level of output minus the previous level of output. Now you'll note that C7 minus C6 here, the change in output going from 0 to 1 worker, well, that's the same as marginal product, right? So I could put C7 minus C6 there, or I could just put marginal product. Either way. I hit enter. Again, I got the marginal cost for this level of output. If I slide this formula down, it's going to slide the references down, and it'll give me my marginal cost data. And you'll notice again that marginal cost will go down typically, it doesn't have to, but typically it'll go down over a small range. Or I should say often it will go down over a small range, but then it always will eventually go up. And that's capturing the idea of diminishing marginal product of labor, or really of any variable input next to fixed inputs in a time-limited production process. That's something hopefully you've learned about. If not, that's going to be a really important application of the marginal cost function. Now let's graph that. Okay, so marginal cost in our case, it went down for a while. Actually started pretty high. It went down. It bottomed out, and then it started going back up. An important thing to note here is that marginal cost is going to intersect the average cost curves, average variable cost and average total cost, at their minima. Remember, we said we're interested in the minimum points here of the average cost curves. Marginal cost, by definition, has to intersect averages at their minima. And I'll briefly explain why. If the marginal is below the average, it's going to be pulling the average down. And if the marginal is above the average, it's going to be pulling the average up. Well, that means it has to intersect the average at the minimum. Okay, so we've got marginal cost, average total cost, average variable cost, average fixed cost, and those are the cost curves of interest in microeconomics, firm, profit max decision making. Okay, now let me jump back into Excel and just briefly show you how we can have Excel create those graphs for us with our actual data from our sample problem. And what we want to do is go up to the Insert tab up here. I'm going to pin that. And what do we want to graph? Well, average cost, so I'm going to select this data. Average fixed cost, I'm going to hold down Control, select average variable cost, holding Control, average total cost, and marginal cost. Now Excel makes it so easy to put graphs in. I'm just going to go up here again under the Insert tab and the line charts option, 2D line, basic 2D line chart right there. And it's set. Now the only thing I need to do is right click on the field and on select data. For the horizontal category axis labels, I want that to be my range of output. So I'm going to select that range there. And then I can actually rename these. I can just edit these and call them the proper names. The data in H, select data. Okay, my data in H is my average variable cost, so I'm going to just rename that ABC. And my data in J is my average total cost, so let's call that ATC. And then my data here in K is my marginal cost, so let's just call that marginal cost. Hit OK. Go down to my chart, and we'll see that I have my marginal cost there in gray. It's going down, it's coming up, it's approximately hitting through the minimum points on the average variable and total cost curves. So that looks right. My average total cost curve is starting high, going down, and then eventually coming back up. My average variable cost likewise. I'm missing one thing here. I want to put my, let me add one more item, and we'll call this AFC. And we'll go ahead and plug in the average fixed cost numbers. Okay, so now we've got average fixed cost declining. And note that average fixed cost, we didn't have a reading for an output level of less than 2. Okay, so there's a nice chart. We can title it here. This is Mike's mowing cost curves. You always want to title your chart. You always want to make sure the axes are labeled properly. Well, that's a pretty nice looking chart right there. And notice the similarity in the structure from these kind of stylized ones I drew here on my whiteboard. So there you have it. Now one final thing, in the sample problem we were looking at, it said see what the difference in total cost and variable cost is, just to make sure that those are equally spaced. And we can find that simply by just taking the total cost at that level of output and subtracting the variable cost. So here's the cell where I'm going to take this cell here, total cost cell, minus the variable cost cell, and I'm going to drag that down. And indeed, that's the same. The total cost and variable costs are separated by what? The difference is the fixed cost, and of course that difference is equal to the amount of fixed costs. So that's kind of a check to make sure we've done things correctly. Hope this has been helpful for you. Check out my other videos for help on your other economics problems. Thanks.